Cooltoon might be one of the most disproportionately hated archetypes in the game's history. Not because it's some innocent baby who's done nothing wrong, but because I've never seen this much vitriolic hate for a deck, even with other decks that were far more unhealthy in design. Cooltoon is an archetype with a lot of great archetypal design on a fundamental level, but someone designing these cards is a gormless cretin, actively going out of their way to pollute the deck's design with numerous effects that create a frustrating gameplay loop, ones that didn't even have a right to exist to begin with. But before we dissect that, I want to start by highlighting the positive elements that actually makes me want to like the archetype. Cooltoon is the first full-fledged archetype to consist of only tuners. There's always been this situation with synchro archetypes where you could end up with an imbalance of non-tuners and tuners. This makes it so there is no imbalance for the deck. With this archetypal structure, they also have unique design in synchro summoning, with all of their synchros requiring only tuners for their synchro summon, save for back-to-back, who leaves flexibility to be made with a synchro in general, similar to how Gotham's allows the flexibility to use multiple tuners for his summon. Because of their design around exclusively using tuners, they can't dig into the usual synchro staples. While you can add in non-tuners to gain access to them, you're not going to have an easy time making it work. Both because of how the archetype is structured, as well as because of their tuner locking. This makes the archetype restricted to a specific niche of design, without specifically locking them into their own archetype. The only problem is that, since this is mostly unexplored design space, it functionally ends up as an archetypal lock. Despite that, they did end up with a single generic synchro tool fit for their design, that being Zalin. While being a negate, it is one that actually demands specific play opportunities to effectively wield. So it's not like the deck ends up with nothing good. On top of making the archetype all tuners, they also implement another element of design that Synchro has neglected, that of requiring specific named tuners for certain synchros. This only really happened with Yusei's Warrior synchros, and that's because they were bad. Not only were the tuners themselves abysmal, most of the synchro payoffs were underwhelming at best, not really warranting the effort to make them. Even going forward with the theme, they would start to do away with the need of specific named tuners, despite designing ones you're clearly meant to use for the new synchro they come with. Ironically, they brought it back with Yusei's latest support, but it wasn't very impactful, and now in retrospect feels like it was purely warming up for what Cooltoon would eventually try to push. So this design never really had a chance to show any promise, but that's because they were designed in such a fundamentally poor way. As it turns out, when you print good cards, a neat tally that summons a name tuner is actually good. With the way Cooltoon is designed, the reliance on specific names for synchros is an actual unique design element. Most of the main deck names get you another card in archetype. Because of this, you have access to every synchro consistently, but you still have to properly manage your resources to get to the right synchros. Rekko can get Mix, and Mix can get Rekko. Both their synchros are level 5s. This means you're put in a scenario where you choose how to use your resources. And while the deck has more tuners, the names and levels make it important to pay attention to how you use your bodies and sequence your synchros, preventing the deck from feeling like it's entirely linear in play. Another important part of the design is that they let you synchro summon using the hand, but only with one card in hand, with that card needing to be a tuner. Because of this, it's much easier to utilize multiple synchros without making the deck perform excessive special summons. It trims the fat of plays similar to how Sword Soul did by just producing a token, but unlike them, Cooltoon does still require the engine itself to operate, since you can't make any of their synchros without a Cooltoon. The main deck names also can't be exploited generically, since their synchro with hand only interacts with tuners in hand, ensuring they can only be used for their niche unless you commit a non-tuner body to the field, which Cooltoon itself isn't going to contribute to at all. So there's no real incentive to use them this way, since you'd be better off with tuners that actually work with your non-tuners. Their ability to synchro with hand can't be negated, which is a point of contention for some. I can't believe I have to say this. It shouldn't be a hot take. Decks should be able to function beyond a single interruption. If you think otherwise, you are not actually meaningfully analyzing the game's balance, which will only further perpetuate the thing you actually don't like. The problem isn't the deck continues to work, it's the unhealthy elements blended into their design that shouldn't have been printed to begin with. If anything, it encourages using actually healthy forms of interaction in the game in order to effectively disrupt them. as getting them off the field will do far more to stop them than negating them. Since most of them fetch another name and can synchro in hand, they function as one-card combos. The deck is hyper-consistent and entirely capable of reliably performing its plays. But despite the prospect of there being so many one-card combos, the deck still operates in a reserved way that isn't snowballing into like 5 million resources and multiple negates from them. In concept. Snake Eyes was a clear example of multiple one-card combos being a problem. However, since Kewl is more limited in overall scope, it creates a lower-to-the-ground deck that consistently gets to perform its game plan, rather than endlessly spin its wheels barfing out every generic endboard piece. At least by the second wave of support. In its first wave, it was pretty fragile and had very little contingency in the long run, burning out on resources fast. While Kewl was pretty consistent with all of its pieces, there was still a bit of weakness in consistency, and a major one in extension. While their field spell gives you an additional normal summon, you'd need to draw into it or their search spell. They have a synchro that can search them, also being one that doesn't need a specific name, but because only one tuner combo in engine total to 4, it could be a bit hard to make both it as well as the other names that enable the game plan. Rotary and Q perfectly resolve this issue. For some reason, I misremembered Q being from the second wave. I'm not rewriting and re-recording this whole section, just disregard me mentioning it as though it was. Rotary gave the deck a level 1 in archetype, making it so you could produce Trackmaker with a level 3 tuner without needing to specifically draw Veiler. Of course, she also came with an extension effect in general, ensuring the deck's able to get a second body on field to keep going. Not only that, but she also had a search effect. Q gave the deck another level 3 body to use, while also being another good starter that can double as extension, getting a tuner when you summon her. With a better overall foundation, their field spell actually got more of a chance to shine. Unfortunately, it feels like field spells have to be a searcher or they're literally unplayable, and to an extent, that seemed to be the case with JJ on release. Its ability to grant an additional normal summon, as well as trade for a name from deck, was always promising, but because of their initial structure, it usually ended up feeling like an act of desperation. But with more names and overall stellar consistency for the deck, it's a perfect card. So far, I've only discussed their surface level design. Their consistency makes them satisfying in that you actually get to consistently play the game with these cards, and their gimmicks and design are unique, but all of that only matters if the archetype itself attempts to meaningfully engage with the game as a whole. Fortunately, one key component of their design actually does, that being that their monsters have effects when used as synchro material. This is a design principle I brought up 2 years ago in my synchro video. It's a great way to make synchro material matter with the mechanic. Synchro as a whole had degraded in gameplay design, since it has to directly compete with links, who don't need specific levels or a specific subtype. Introducing an importance on being used as synchro material makes a tangible difference that makes using them for synchros matter. Both Yummy and Kewl are synchro archetypes that took that principle and made it provide their archetypes with great interactions. For the most part. However, Kewl took this design a step further and integrated ways to specifically copy those effects, with Playlist and Loudness War able to apply the synchro material effect of a card engrave, giving the archetype more ways to use their removal effects, getting more mileage out of them as a part of the deck's core gameplay element. Of course, these are disruptive effects that require your opponent to be playing the game for them to matter. So the other important part of their gameplay is that they actually synchro summon on the opponent's turn, wielding synchro summoning as their main form of disruptions. For a long chunk of time, most synchro strategies would just be an extensive combo deck that produces multiple uninteractive endboard pieces, usually just a bunch of negates or even floodgates. This still happens, but it's becoming far less common in newer synchro archetypes. Shifting design to actually make the act of synchro summoning disruptive is far more engaging and healthy. Remix is the premier synchro for this design, as you can make her going first, then turn her into disruptions on your opponent's turn as a quick effect. With Mix's synchro material effect popping a monster, she becomes a solid way for the deck to disrupt plays. But the deck's plays aren't entirely constricted to her, otherwise it'd be extremely fragile. Their other main form of synchro summoning on the opponent's turn is their quick play spell, Kewl Synchro. It functions as a search spell, but has the added effect to let you synchro summon immediately after doing so, allowing the deck to find another tuner effect to fire off as a synchro material on your opponent's turn. There's dynamic decisions to be made based on board state. Kewl Synchro also has a very specific upside to it, that being that the card is a twice per turn quick play spell. So even if you draw multiples, even if you draw all 3, those are still good draws. This gives the deck a great way to keep making synchro plays on the opponent's turn. Although, their final boss monster would further iterate and perfect this form of design for the deck. Back-to-back lets you grab a tuner from grave or banishment if your opponent activates a monster effect, letting you either special summon it or add it to hand. Then once that resolves, you can synchro summon. This can be done twice per turn, meaning you can just cycle back bodies and synchro multiple times, affording you more ways to interact with a given board state, rather than putting you in a scenario where you have to make blanket solutions that invalidate gameplay. Back-to-back also resolved another issue the deck had. That being that while their stats could get sizable, that wasn't a guarantee, and they were typically too low on numbers to push for game, which, when paired with their ability to burn out of resources, meant the deck wasn't super good at actually finishing games. Back-to-back giving every tuner multi-attacking makes it easy to actually close out games with damage. However, this is where the list of positives ends, and where I start highlighting the reasons I can't bring myself to like the archetype as it currently exists. The true reason to hate this archetype is its TCG name. People will complain about literally any and every localization ever. Doesn't matter if it's actually good or not. But this is genuinely an insulting case no matter who you ask. The entire idea of the archetype is musicians that are also assassins. They're all named in relation to music, with most being named after a specific process or term pertaining to music making. And the killer tune name punctuates that. The pun is in literal English in the Japanese name. You didn't have to localize it, let alone translate it. The only observable reason behind the usage of the phrase cool is likely an analog for outdated slang, like how killer is. But even then, killer isn't an outdated term in remotely the same way cool is. Killer is an actual word. That's the whole reason the damn pun works. Cool isn't a real word used in an alternative sense of the phrase. It's an alternate spelling of an existing word. One of the immediate guesses as to why this was done is because it was to censor the word killer, so it had to change to something else. Killer Needle exists. You're a bit late, bud. Why did we do this? Watch now they change him to Redacted Needle. Even if they had to make this change, it has no reason to be renamed this way specifically. There is no legitimate etymological reason either. The only etymological reasoning I could find is the intended pronunciation of cool. But given the fact I've uttered the word intended, that already signals the issue. Kewl is the intended pronunciation. The game's official pronunciation is Cool Tune. How did English get lost in translation twice in English? But even then, not only does no one even use that pronunciation in the context of these cards, you'd have to chug a 6-pack of Busch Lights before you even mishear the word kill from the pronunciation. The only thing it legitimately retains is the initial KT for the archetype, but the initials aren't even a relevant part of the archetype. Every other TCG region language doesn't really bother to retain it, and just base it off the English one. You know, where the pronunciation gets lost entirely because there isn't a Californian accent in German. Das ist fucking Kewl. The only one that almost does it justice is French, being pronounced sun Kewl. But again, that requires the pronunciation that isn't even used officially. Worse yet, doing the bare minimum of Google translating the word kill from French, I think there was an even better pun overlooked for the French name. Even if for some reason they couldn't use the word killer, they could have just called them wicked or radical tune, since they facilitate the idea of old slang that also has a double meaning that pertains to their violent assassin work. This is genuinely one of the worst localizations in the game, to the point it is somehow more infuriating to me than the genuinely unhealthy card design. Was that the plan? Drown out the abysmal design with god-awful naming? Surely no one will play them if we just give them a terrible name. In terms of their actual gameplay, earlier I drew a comparison to Sword Soul with their ability to easily create synchros with one card for a more low-to-the-ground playstyle. Funnily enough, that's not all they have in common. Is that yesterday's gameplay? Today's cards? The standard end board is pretty similar to what Sword Soul produced, with RS and Zalin resembling the age-old end board of Barone and Chi Xiao. An end board of 2 negates essentially invalidates all the positive interactions I outlined earlier. They give the deck Remix as an interesting form of interaction, then they make her level partner an Omni-negate, so you likely cycle back a hand trap and summon out a negate. While RS can only hit cards on field, and Zon is at least an interesting dynamic form of negation that requires proper sequencing to utilize effectively, an end board of 2 negates is still just that. It's the most shallow form of gameplay. Worse yet, Amritara, the only other unique synchro the deck can make, is being used exclusively to add another negate to the end board. This is one of the worst types of gameplay loops that the game can produce. When you're ending on multiple negates, just attempting to prevent your opponent from playing the game, then stomping them out when they never even got the chance to play to begin with. And even if your opponent can play through them all, it's an utterly bland gameplay experience for both players. However, it goes from bland to insufferable when paired with 2 other effects in archetype. Rotary, when used as synchro material, lets you look at your opponent's hand for cost. Why for cost? Hell if I know. Then, when paired with Q's synchro material effect, stacking the opponent's top card and ripping one away, there just is no agency in the game at all. The only way you lose with both of these resolving is if your opponent just opened the God Hand and 2 unbelievable top decks, so you quite literally couldn't stop them. Contextual to the deck's intended playstyle, Rotary seems fine. The deck plays a much lower to the ground style of game, so to make up for this power disparity, you're given the ability to know your opponent's cards to better utilize your limited interactions. But when your main interactions are negates, you just spot the most important cards and stop them from resolving. There isn't actually a dynamic to mapping out how to best use your cards. You don't have to think about how your cards interact with your opponents to figure out the best window to use them, because that's what mass negation does to gameplay. Invalidate engagement entirely. You're not meant to think about how to navigate sequences, just how to prevent them from playing out in the first place. Back-to-back is too much of a commitment for the deck to make regularly as its main calling in gameplay. But this sort of gameplay isn't. The less interesting playstyle is directly incentivized over the one that is engaging. I've seen back-to-back summoned more in decks that aren't cool tuned, and when I've seen back-to-back actually summon in the archetype, it's still facilitating this style of play far more often than not. Oh, but don't worry, Cool Tune seems to be falling off in the OCG, in favor of a deck that does the same thing as Rotary, but even worse. On top of playing out as a fuckface combo deck, Hand Knowledge is a design pattern that needs to stop being used so loosely right now. They put it on RB, no one played it, so they thought it was okay to try again. Then they put it on K9, and now we're starting to realize this may have been a bad design direction, after already upping the ante twice. Hand Knowledge is an obscenely large gameplay advantage. It's why just about every card that did it regularly doesn't anymore. One element of the game's competitive skill set is being able to correctly identify potential threats and play optimally according to the odds of them being present, knowing when to best use your resources. In plenty of cases, the threats can be overbearing on a broader scale, since some of these are highly arbitrary things. No amount of technical skill with a given deck will expertly weave through it, but it can still be an expert display of ability and overall game awareness, knowing how to best weigh your options and shape your plays around potential outcomes to ultimately win the game. Hand Knowledge removes this element of skill entirely, making it contentious design by its very nature. As a kid, I always gravitated toward the card Mind on Air. It's a god-awful level 6 that lets you see your opponent's hand while it's on field. When I first learned about pendulums, my immediate thought was pendulum summoning this abysmal card. Hand Knowledge was always this alluring thing to me. Perfect game knowledge means everything would be decided entirely by the player's technical skill and their draws. Maybe I'm not Hellkaiser pilled enough, but I never really enjoy praying your opponent plays suboptimally based on chance just so you can win. I shouldn't have to actively disrespect my opponent and hope it manifests so I win. Besides, how am I ever supposed to improve my technical play if I'm only playing against opponents that constantly misplay? I'm never put into scenarios where I have to play better. Hand Knowledge in a sense levels this issue out, but there's one major issue with that idea though. This is one-sided. If this was a respect play scenario, maybe there'd be a case. You sort of play with a revealed hand nowadays, since you'll play out most, if not your entire hand, through the course of a game. but that doesn't acknowledge the problem that it causes in a modern context. A massive power disparity. The game's overall balance has to meaningfully acknowledge the power gap it creates. Kewl didn't. It removes the entire element of adaptability. The design the deck flexes with its synchro material effects and quick synchro ability. You will effectively decide games from Rotary's reveal and Kew's top deck stack, since you're playing a non-game with perfect knowledge. This is the gameplay loop that's enabled, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. For some ungodly reason, they decided the deck should have the capacity to rip cards from the extra deck. Both Clip and Crackle rip cards from the extra deck. Clip hits randomly when used as synchro material. Then Crackle, who has to be made with Clip, lets you actually pick what you rip. And if you synchro off Crackle, you can rip 2 more cards. Regardless of how little this aspect of their design gets utilized, it is design that only ever produces miserable gameplay. It also makes the gimmick of copying set effects nauseating. I think the reasoning behind the extra deck rips had a design balance in mind. The deck wasn't too good at OTKing, and could burn out on resources, making it pretty vulnerable in a grind game. So ripping cards from your opponent's extra is a way to sort of prevent yourself from getting OTK'd. Clip and Crackle rip 2 cards, with Crackle's banish even returning the card in end phase. So if you choose a crucial piece, your opponent whiffs their turn basically, while the deck also doesn't stomp them immediately after they whiff their turn. But, you know how you introduced cards that literally change that? Yeah, I don't know why you thought this was a good idea if you were going to immediately go back on the balancing for it. Even if the deck did maintain good on that balance, it still would have been miserable to play. You've just chosen the worst of both worlds. The deck has more interesting gameplay maneuvers, but it still has the god-awful ones, and you chose to double down on them. Clip is a turn 0 card for the archetype. Since Crackle didn't come with the archetype on release, they weren't worth maxing out on, because there wasn't a synchro to access consistently if you drew it. And after getting one, they still aren't worth it, because maxing out for extra deck rips that maybe fade your opponent's plays doesn't matter, because the deck has a guaranteed way to fade them regardless. Meaning if that element were removed, we'd just be trading into another miserable gameplay loop. One that never had a reason to exist to begin with. Then we have Kewl, another card with an overall great effect, then another needless design decision that causes problems. Why does Kewl summon any tuner? Granted, there is no world wherein summoning Rose Whip was going to produce healthy interactive Yu-Gi-Oh! Regardless of how it's summoned. But it's 2026. I do not understand how we are still printing cards that say, summon or search any card of a broad card demographic, and can't even foresee how that will cause a problem. Doesn't matter how bad or restrictive they seem, just because it's contained doesn't magically make the broad range of access okay design space. Then there's also the other gimmick of the archetype's design, one that feels entirely superfluous, except for when it utterly ruins the game. They decided to give the deck a weird form of level floodgating, with both back-to-back and RS boosting the level of monsters. RS only boosting monsters with 1700 or lower by 1 level, and back-to-back boosting all your opponent's monsters by 2 regardless. This design can devastate certain synchro decks and completely screw over Xyz decks. Just run higher ranks. Not only is that stupid, it's also not an actual legitimate answer. Some decks will have a good alternative higher rank Xyz to go into, but not all ranks are created equal. And even then, you're likely only going to play one, because you can't afford to suddenly commit space to Xyz that you can only summon against this exact deck. Not only that, there's the part where you play the actual game. If I know my opponent is playing an Xyz strategy while I'm playing Kewl, the moment they summon an Xyz while hit with this floodgate, I know they'll evaporate on the spot if I remove it. This introduces absolutely nothing positive to overall gameplay or balance. It legitimately only creates misery. Lastly, perhaps the worst thing about Kewl on a fundamental level isn't even directly a fault of the deck itself. Rather, something that was waiting to become a problem. This being the unfortunate relationship that the deck has with hand traps. Unfortunately, for some godforsaken reason, every single powerful 1-for-1 hand trap ever printed is a tuner. And wouldn't you know it, A new powerful staple is a tuner. This actively encourages the worst form of deck building in the game, maxing out on hand traps to stop all of your opponent's plays. And since the archetype is full of one-card combo enablers, there's no real downside to doing this. Since you can spend multiple hand traps shutting out your opponent, then play the game normally. Because of the deck's reliance on monsters in hand, similar to Vanquish Soul, the deck doesn't really want to be playing a ton of non-engine spell traps. So, like Vanquish Soul, they chose to make use of hand traps to fill that void. They were a perfect fit because of their synchro with hand design, as well as being able to cycle one back to hand even if it was used for combos. However, unlike Vanquish Soul, they're not constrained to attributes. As a result, there's no meaningful limit on what hand traps you can play. So I must now ask, why did we make them all tuners? Was it for this moment exactly? Because if they weren't all tuners, this never would have happened. It wasn't like they did anything useful as tuners, so why did you have to let this happen? While the overall health of what Cool Toon does on paper is far better than Snake Eyes, the fact gameplay devolves into this doesn't lead to an actual healthier game than what it produced regardless. You are demanded to remove Cool Toon names from field to meaningfully stop them from executing their gameplay loop, because the non-engine in their deck is going to stop you entirely from executing yours, which means you won't actually get a chance to interact with Cool Toon. Their resilience and consistency becomes an issue because the entire power dynamic is thrown off. You have to contest not only their resilience, but the fact you'll have to likely survive a bullet hell of hand traps. You're not playing on remotely equal footing. And as stated, Cool Toon is one of the only decks capable of that. So you're being forced to play this deck, and not even with its intended playstyle in mind. Because of this relationship with hand traps, games devolve into non-engine versus non-engine, the sort of gameplay that generates non-games. Even when the deck can run out of gas because of this gameplay loop, because Konami are Konami, there are still pot cards in the game, so they can just draw more resources if all else fails. Hell, Cool Toon even played the Heralds in Genesis. They're not even all tuners, only orange is, but they are negation, and despite making you go -2, and the deck only having one fairy, people still played it. You pair this miserable gameplay loop of hand trap hell with the on-field negates the engine makes, as well as the hand and top deck knowledge, it just creates an overall miserable experience. So, what can even be done to correct the course of this deck's design? For starters, erase Crackle and Clip, then replace them with a less evil pair. Instead, introduce a pair that does what Q should've. Stack your own deck, then let you draw a card, letting you load the chamber, then pull the trigger by having a draw effect. If you changed Clip and Crackle to perform this function instead, people would actually love it. If you print Draw a Card on any card, people will love it. If you print Rip a Card from your opponent's hand or extra deck, you're creating a card that literally everyone will hate. Do the thing people like, and not the thing people despise. Kewl and Rotary, on the other hand, they legitimately have good effects throughout that the deck needs. So it'd be great if they just erased the text written by a cretin. Errata Q to only summon a Cool Toon. Legitimately, there was no good reason to make her summon any tuner in the game. Q's stacking and Rotary's hand reveal are where we still have issues though. For some reason, in this game that is continuously updated, they refuse to update cards when they clearly failed to balance them out of the gate, because doing so would be an admission that they made a mistake, something a corporate entity will never admit to. They would sooner hit it on a list before they admit they forgot to write 3 very important words on the card. And that's something else they don't like to do. But when they do errata cards, they don't remove text entirely. It only alters existing text, which is why it's so frustrating, because they can very easily be adjusted, but they just won't. I think Q's stack effect is fine in isolation, but when paired with hand knowledge, it just isn't. So if one's gotta go, I'd say it's Rotary. Although they could attempt to change the reveal effect on Rotary. Since we're cutting Clip, we can change what we look at to be the extra deck. Instead of Clip and Crackle ripping cards to potentially ruin games, you can just look at it instead with Rotary, The idea behind the hand reveal is getting knowledge on your target and planning according to that. This still fits the mechanical theming around assassin work. In fact, it's a better representation of it, because actively tampering with your target's routine means there's a chance that you blow your cover. Just looking at the extra is a healthier form of this, since you find out what they're up to, but don't have them dead to rights from the outset. And of course, it has less weight in a best of 3. In terms of entirely new cards for the deck, there's not much else I think the deck needs. There's one specific niche I think they could have ironed out, that being a high-level main deck tuner that isn't named Phydraulis. Give the deck a way to make back-to-back easier to summon with one synchro on field. Of course, this hyper-specific niche of design isn't gonna make for a good card on its own, so give it some flexibility in design. Have it able to special summon out by shaving levels off itself, similar to Tsukudo. That way it can be used more flexibly in archetype. Instead of just being an easier back-to-back, this design can also double as a way to let the deck consistently make Loudness War, which would happen occasionally, but not very regularly. Speaking of, they could stand to introduce a gimmick to improve it, and remix by extent. Part of why Loudness War isn't all that important is because it's got 0 attack. JJ makes it a 3k beat stick, but only if your opponent has a tuner in play. So giving your opponent a tuner could actually make Loudness a better asset, granting a way to ensure it and Remix can be 3k beat sticks, as well as put a small punching bag on your opponent's field. In terms of correcting their floodgate effects, genuinely, I think the best thing you could do is introduce other monsters that counteract the increase. This means if you utilize the full suite, you don't floodgate your opponent, but a suboptimal board can, which also changes the dynamic around the decks it does and doesn't screw over, as decks that do get hurt by it have less of a hurdle to overcome numerically if they decide to commit to that, and decks that are unimpacted by it have to push through more hurdles. It's not perfect, but it's better than what it is now. The last thing I'd like is design infrastructure that disincentivizes playing a million hand traps. The problem is, that isn't really easy to do. The best way to do that naturally is develop a better payoff by doing something else, but that's not easy to achieve, as the idea of being better than stopping everything your opponent does isn't exactly a thing you can be better than, especially not in a healthy way. A gameplay incentive is introducing more traps, and by extension, a reason to play their existing trap card. Introducing design around traps that makes playlist more worthwhile to play, and potentially cut generic hand traps from the equation. A Sutra, Ashtray, she can use me as an ashtray, or whatever it gets localized as, is a new synchro archetype whose tuners are exclusively trap monsters, of which perform synchro summons when activated, utilizing synchro summoning on the opponent's turn in a similar manner to Kewl. As such, Kewl could stand to do with similar design, but instead of just one-to-one copying this design, it could also be a means to expand on another element of design. Since the archetype is name dependent for their synchros, these traps could send a Kewl to grave to copy their name, then synchro summon, with the archetype's usual ability to use a card in hand. To introduce a new dynamic, they could have their own static level as a trap monster and simply be treated as the sent name. That way you can print a trap of each level that can be any name. Though, this design shift poses a few weaknesses. For starters, now that there'd be a trap lineup, there's a risk of drawing too many of them, leaving you unable to synchro on your turn, and in that case no one's going to take up this route in deck building over hand traps. Of course, the other issue is that they can't be of use going second, which is one of the deck's only realistic existing weaknesses. And if we're actually correcting the overall health of the deck, we'd actually want to solve that. So it'd probably help to allow you to activate them sooner under certain circumstances for that scenario specifically. Similar to how the Malice traps can activate sooner by banishing a Malice on field. Maybe giving it a clause that replaces the send with a hand reveal instead to activate it immediately. That way they can still be used as tuners if you're going second, but copying a name in hand is going to be less impactful than hand picking one. Alternatively, the clause could be more aggressively designed towards playing going second. broken, in a vein that clearly acknowledges your opponent having an advantageous board presence. Unironically, it could have a similar clause to the original Cyber Dragon. Something like, if your opponent controls a monster and you don't, you can activate it the turn it's set, and it summons the tuner from deck alongside the trap instead of copying its name, letting you use traps as starters for plays without burning your normal summon, giving the deck another form of one-card synchro, but limiting its capacity to do that to a circumstance where that's actually appropriate design. Of course, regardless of how effective these individual trap cards are, they'd still need to implement design infrastructure around traps as a whole in the deck being a big part of their gameplay. That way, the one trap that isn't a tuner is still worthwhile to include. They could implement the Eldritch style of design, having each one float into another archetypal spell trap, but honestly, I'd reserve that to just one of the traps and give them all unique effects. These should be more of an analog to the synchro material effects from the monsters. They could introduce a new name that lets you set a trap from deck, then give it a synchro that allows you to activate archetypal traps the turn they're set. That way, if you can make it at all, a hand bricked with traps can actually make plays, giving the deck a way to turn all of its traps into a straight flow combo. It's also possible you make this sort of synchro be one that needs Rotary, since she's already a spell trap searcher. But of course, that means leaving her legal. As a final point, I would have liked one guy that could have been treated as a non-tuner, but ultimately, I think that'll do more harm than good. Elf Notes is another synchro archetype in the meta right now, and it's pretty hated. In part because it has a hand rip, but also because the deck effectively tinkers with the standard generic synchro endboards that produce unengaging gameplay. If anything, I want to see even more generic synchros that Kewl Toon can make because of their design, either in that they require all tuners as material, or have open-ended materials that can also be only tuners. Give them more general tools, but use this clean slate as an opportunity to healthier forms of interaction. Naturally, it'd be nice to do that for the general synchro pool, but I think you could use the specific summoning method with only tuners for more unique design in general. Kewl Toon is an archetype with a lot of solid design principles. It genuinely has a lot of things I like, but just because some design elements are done right, doesn't mean I can turn a blind eye to all the egregious design they decided to mix in with them. I want to see this deck become better, not purely in the sense of power, but in overall health. It's an archetype whose healthy design elements and unique gameplay should be lauded, but that can't be the case unless action is actually taken towards improving them. While it's likely they just get hit on the ban list and phased out like everything else, I do hope that one day there's a good reason to actually like the deck.